Hi, everyone, and welcome to Atkins Library. I'm Abby Moore, Education, Honors, and Global Engagement Librarian and Children's and Young Adults Literature Enthusiast. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for what will be an exciting conversation between Gail Haley and Dr. Mark West. Gail Haley is a Charlotte, North Carolina native and world-renowned artist and children's book author. She has published over 40 children's books to date and is the recipient of the Caldecott Medal, England's Kate Greenaway Medal, and Japan's Kode Tosho Award. She was a writer in residence at Appalachian State University. Her manuscript collections and oral history interviews are housed in Atkins Special Collections, and her children's books can be found in circulation on the second floor and in the rare book room on the 10th floor of the library. Dr. Mark West is a professor of English at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where he teaches courses on children's literature and young adult literature. He also holds the title of Bonnie E. Cohn Professor in Civic Engagement. He has written or edited 16 books, the most recent of which is Shapers of American Childhood, which he co-edited with Kathy Murlock Jackson. Please join me in welcoming Gail Haley and Dr. Mark West.
Thank you, Abby. And Gail, welcome to our campus. You're part of our campus all the time because your papers and some of your original art are right upstairs in this very building. So it's in many ways, there's a Gail Haley presence on our campus all of the time. But it's great to have the actual one and only original in the body Gail Haley right here at the library. For those who don't know, Gail and I go way back. I've known you for a long time, Gail. I don't know, at least 20 years, maybe 30.
Oh, at least 30, I think.
Yes, I remember you would come to our house when our son was just little, and now our son is all growing up. But we're here today to celebrate the 50th anniversary of your wonderful book, A Story, winning the Caldecott Medal. For those who don't know much about the big awards in children's literature, in the world of picture books within the United States, there is no award bigger than the Caldecott Medal. It is a real accomplishment to win the Caldecott Medal, and when an author such as yourself wins one, it puts you in the big leagues when it comes to picture book authors, and there you've been ever since. So you won that award 50 years ago. Yes. But what I'd like to start off with is if you could tell us a little bit about your origins as a girl growing up just a little bit north of Charlotte. I know you were born here in Charlotte. Yes. And how your experiences, I know your father used to work for the Charlotte Observer, how those experiences kind of set the stage for you to take an interest in stories like A Story.
Well, first of all, when I was growing up, there was still segregation, and I was very aware of it. I would come to Charlotte on the weekends to do tap dancing and marimba lessons because my mother wanted me to be a movie star, and all I ever wanted to do was write and draw. And when I was 8 years old, I knew I wanted to write and illustrate children's books. And I knew it was possible because I would watch the artists drawing pictures and all these wonderful tools that they used to use. And then I'd go and meet all the different writers. And sometimes after their stories were edited, I'd carry them down to the linotype operator, which sounded like a freight train. Mm-hmm. And people are shocked to realize the Charlotte Observer was actually printed from raised type mm-hmm. when I was a child, mm-hmm. just like Gutenberg. Mm-hmm. So on Sunday morning, I'd go out and get the paper out of that round box, and there would be the pictures I'd seen people doing and the words I'd seen people writing. And of course, I was in love with books early, as far as I can remember, and before that. So I knew you could translate what you've got inside onto paper. Mm-hmm. And I loved books. So I knew when I was 8 years old, I wanted to write and illustrate children's books.
Now, I know your father was the art director for the Observer for a time, and he had an interest, I know, in visual art and commercial art. Did he encourage you in terms of your interest in making art, or how did that all work out in terms of your childhood?
My parents didn't want me to be an artist. um, and, as I said, my mother wanted me to be a movie star, but my father, well, he kind of encouraged me to be good at it, but he didn't want me to do anything where it was going to be a career.
Mhm.
And they actually just didn't believe in women having careers. I mean, my mother said, well, one day to go off to art school, you'll be able to do drawings for Belks and shoe advertisements
Mhm.
and do things for the telephone book, stuff like
Mhm.
that. So they really didn't think of a career for a girl.
Mhm.
And they didn't let me go to New York
Mhm.
because they were afraid I'd get in trouble.
Mhm. They're
Uh,
probably right.
yeah, well, I got in trouble in Richmond, that was, and they were all afraid I was going to get in trouble, but I was less likely to get in trouble than anyone else because I knew that I had to go to art school. And if anything had happened that was the least bit off color, I would have been yanked out of there. So, I was a good girl.
Well, I know that you also developed an interest in mythology and stories from your childhood as well. I know these two areas that converge in your work, your interest in stories and mythology and folklore, and your interest in the visual arts converge, of course, in the medium of picture books. But can you talk a little bit about how you became interested in old myths and that side of your growing up years?
Well, I don't know anyone who remembers the children's book room of the public library, but it was just a wonderland.
The old Carnegie Library.
It had 3-story stained glass windows of the fairy tales. And they would let me go wherever I wanted to, which I've continued to do until recently. And I would go up in the library. They had glass floors, and as you went up, and I discovered Bullfinch's mythology, 8 or 9.
Mhm.
And you're always disappointed because the Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny had turned out to be bogus. But I knew I had found stories that would never let me down,
Mhm.
and I just ate them up. I absorbed them,
Mhm.
and that has never changed. I still have bullfinches and all kinds of other folklore around my house. I've also studied the work of Carl Jung,
Mhm.
and there is this sort of innate thing that happens um, in the unconscious, that we become aware of things that we don't maybe aren't even taught.
Mhm.
And so it was just something about, they resonated with me, all these
Mhm.
old stories.
Mhm.
And so I think that was what I lived on.
Mhm. Well, I've heard stories from you and others about that old Carnegie Library, which unfortunately was segregated for a time.
It was.
They that ended, but the people who were able to go to that old Carnegie Library have marvelous stories to tell of the resources and the architecture of the building itself. Then, of course, when the new library came in the mid 1950s, the old Carnegie building was knocked down. Interestingly enough, the new library, that spot in downtown, it's always been where the library is.
Yeah.
They just keep they build a library, they knock it down, they build a new library, they knock it down, they build a new library. They're about to do it again.
Well, you mentioned that. When I was a kid, I knew that things were happening were wrong. I mean, I saw people get on the bus and go to the back of the bus.
Mhm.
And I could feel the sadness. I mean, I've always been able to kind of read people. And what really killed me as a child, I'd say it's wrong, and they'd say, you're going to get in trouble if you talk like that. You'll understand when you grow up. But I didn't. I left the South.
Mhm.
But yeah, that when I found that out as a kid, it just crushed me.
Mhm.
The fact that Black children couldn't go to the library, because that was my life, being
Yeah.
able to go there.
Well, luckily for you, you were able to go there and learn all those stories. And then, as I understand it, you headed off to Richmond and went to art school and developed interest in a type of art that I wondered if you could talk about, which was printing, whether it was wood blocks or linoleum blocks, which is a very tactile sort of style of art. I do linoleum block printing myself, so I have an interest in that from a personal point of view. But I wondered if you could talk about how you became interested in that style of art, and then how that might relate to the wonderful art that we see in A Story, a Story.
Well, I like, as you know, I've done just about every medium in different books, and I like for the art to have the feeling of the culture that I'm illustrating. And I went to the University of Virginia. My parents had told me I could have 2 years of art school, and then I had to go to Queens and learn how to be a lady. Well, I got married instead, so I didn't ever become a lady. But yes, the head of the department was Charles Smith, and he was a well-known graphic artist. His linoleum cuts were into collections all over the world. And I loved printing. I loved the printing presses. But see, I'd grown up around printing presses, you know, so this was something kind of in my blood too. And I adored printing. And he told me to go to New York and try to sell my books. And I had about 7 or 8 books that I had written and illustrated. Went to New York. I looked a whole lot younger in those days. And they patted me on the head and said I was, you know, I had a lot of promise. But somebody actually mentioned doing something from folklore so that people could look at what I was doing and understand whether I had translated it properly. And I had a friend who had collected skip rope rhymes when she lived in Washington. She was much, much older than I was.
Francia Butler? Is that who?
Francia Butler.
Yeah, I knew Francia.
Yeah. And so we did that. And then she still had an agent in New York. We sent the dummy of the book to our Blanche Gregory, and probably within 6 months we had sold it. But in the meantime, it wasn't even that long, because in the meantime, I wanted to prove to everybody that I could really do a book. So I borrowed $500 from the bank, and I bought ink and wood and paper, certain kind of paper, and I cut. I told a story in wood blocks, and I set the type myself. I found a gentleman printer in outside of Charlottesville, which is where we were, and he told me that he would help me print it if I would load the press, help him clean up, and collate it myself. I said, deal. So that's how it happened. And then just about the time that I was trying to market the book, I went to Washington to get my copyright. And it was about this time of year, and all the bookstores were so busy. And I went to Brentano's bookstore and asked to see the buyer. And of course, well, you don't do that. But anyway, they let me go downstairs, and I was trying to show him my book, and he was not interested in me at all. You know? And I was just trying to convince him. I don't think we got noisy, but maybe we did, because this door opened up, and this distinguished Italian man came out who looked like Vittorio De Sica. And he said, "What seems to be the trouble?" And I said, "I was just trying to show your buyer my book that I've hand printed." Well, he took the book and looked at it, looked through all of it, smiled, and said to his buyer, "I can't tell you how to run your store, but if I were you, I'd buy the whole edition." So they bought $500 worth, and that was enough to go back and pay the bank off. So then I besieged the publishing world to get to get started. So it was doing the skip rope book that really started everything.
Well, and a certain amount of grit and initiative that I've always identified with in terms of you. You always figure out a way to make things happen.
Well, I'm just a shy and retiring Southern girl.
Yeah, right. Now, Story is Story. It's not your first book, but it was the book that really put you on the.
Was it my 10th book?
Yeah, the book that everybody, when people think of Gail Haley, they think of A Story, a Story. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you first became familiar with the stories that you wrote and then, of course, illustrated in your Caldecott award-winning book. How did that come about?
Well, I left my husband and ran off with this much older man, and um, and met all kinds of people, filmmakers, Andy Warhol, all kinds of people. And we went to the Caribbean. We went to St. Thomas before St. Thomas was so many, condos and everything. And I used to put a flower in my hair, a hibiscus in my hair every morning, or in my hat, go down to the waterfront to buy, vegetables and fruits. And the women who sold things there had come from many different islands to St. Thomas, and they would sit around under umbrellas with their heaps of things that they were selling. And I just loved to talk to them. And one of the things I kept hearing them talk about, every once in a while, I'd hear the name Anansi. And when anyone said his name, they'd look up in the tree or up in the umbrellas, because Anansi is a spider. When he's a spider and when he's a man, he's this trickster. And they were afraid that Anansi was hiding somewhere and he was going to use their information against them. Well, I just got really interested and asked them to tell me stories. And then I met someone who had a collection that he had made. And things fell apart down there. And we went back to New York, and I was 6 months pregnant. And I wasn't doing any books right there. I had to find an apartment, move in, put up curtains. And when my little girl was 6 months old, we were sitting on the bed one day, and I was thinking, I really need to get back to doing my books. And I went to sleep, and I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I knew somebody was in our apartment. And I went from room to room, turning on lights. And just before I got to the studio, I knew Anansi was there. He was there. When I turned on the light, I didn't see him. But when a character starts visiting you at 4 o'clock in the morning, you've got to do something, right? And so that's how I started to work. And then I would go down to the public library just as many times as I could. And I was lucky enough to find that seminal book. When they let you go into the stacks yourself, you find the one book you're looking for. It was by a man named Arthur Rattray. And he had lived among the Ashanti people and taken their stories down verbatim in their language, phonetically, and then translated them. And I found that, in their eyes, Anansi was sometimes a spider, but sometimes a man. And the stories in the Caribbean had come from West Africa.
That part of Africa, yeah.
Yeah. And some of the names were even the same. His son was named Takuma, and that's what they call him in the Caribbean. The one thing I found that was interesting was the stories were a little meaner in the Caribbean. He was a little bit more, not entirely an admirable character. And I think it was because the slaves didn't have anything in the Caribbean. So it was like Anansi became their alter ego, their avatar. And so he had to be a little bit more vicious in order to get. But I was totally in love with Anansi. And I thought about doing it as a Caribbean story, but there was a lot of prejudice among Black people in this country against Caribbean people. So I decided to take it back to Africa and do it from there.
Well, one of the things that I love about a story is the flora and fauna.
Yeah.
The plants, the lushness of the trees and the great big, wonderful, beautiful looking leaves. And so, and just the feel of the place you have through your art, you really sort of evoke a sense of place. How did you get a feel for that side of the book?
Well, I had much more of an English palette. It was more pale. But living in the Caribbean just blew my socks off. I mean, the sun was there, and it was beautiful, and it was like being in a bath almost. And I just fell in love with all the colors that were around me everywhere. So it changed my whole sense of color. Right.
Well, it's such a vivid, vibrant part of the book. I think it's one of the things that you just open up the pages of a story, and you can't help but just be drawn in by the color and, of course, by the characters in the story. But in terms of your approach to the art, I know you use linoleum block
Wood.
blocks. I thought you used linoleum blocks in the story.
Not for this.
Wood blocks. So can you tell a little bit about the process? There's a technical term people sometimes use, color separation, and I think it relates to this book. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. Well, Jean Carl at Athenaeum fell in love with the book. I was in the Caribbean, actually, in Martinique, when I heard the book had sold. And I got back and went to see Jean Carl, and she said, I just love all the colors. I love everything you've done, but we can't afford to do color separation. Can you do color separation? I said, well, yeah, I know how. And I didn't know what I was letting myself in for. I totally hand separated this book. But I had to, how can I say this? If you overlap colors, I don't know if they can do it with computers, but if you're not careful how you overlap colors, and when they had screens, it makes a moire. So I had to hand separate every single picture. I think this picture here, which is the one that the library's been using, had 14 different blocks. By and large, it was only 3 or 4 blocks. But then this one had all these little smaller blocks. I think there's an exhibit downstairs where you can see all the different people that I cut out.
It's a so each of these images would be a different block that would be assembled into one picture.
The colors, the block is right here.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. That is just the green plate. You have to start out with a key block, and I think that was the pale color here. And then you have to transfer that onto other blocks so that everything matches up.
Right.
And it's completely.
Well, let's talk a little bit. I've studied the history of illustration and the history of picture books. And so I know a little bit about what you're talking about, but not from a practitioner's point of view. And I am sure that in this age of computerized imagery, that most people haven't the faintest idea what we're talking about in terms of color separation, because it's something that it goes back to an earlier era. Can you talk a little bit about technically what is that? When they say color separation, what does that actually involve, and why did they have to do it? Why did they have to do color separation? What was the requirement?
Well, things were a little bit primitive in those days, and if you have two halftones and you don't know what you're doing, you get this moire. It just does terrible things. Most people who did color separation don't want to talk about it, and most of them are dead now anyway. But you had to use this stinky stuff. What did it smell like? It smelled like a home permanent. And you had to use this fluid to pull the color up. And then you would have to use one different one for each color. And somehow it was all keyed together with when you use the smelly stuff. I forget what it was. But nobody else ever wanted to talk about it. The Dillons were among the people. And the
Diane Dillon.
Yeah, and the Provinsons had done it too.
So nowadays, for multicolored picture books, which most picture books are nowadays, I mean, sometimes people will look at older picture books and say, boy, people back in a long time ago, they didn't like color because all the illustrations are black and white. Only a couple of color pictures. I wonder why people didn't like color then. And they don't understand that the reason for that is that to have full color illustrations was such an expensive and arduous process. But nowadays, when people have full color illustrations, how does that process work? Is it all just done?
You don't do anything. You just give me a piece of art, and the computer does all of it.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that an awful lot of books are just 2 colors. So you might have yellow and blue, and then you get green. And I can remember one editor, I can't remember who she was, and it was something I was just illustrating, and she didn't think that I was going to get the color of green that I said I was going to get. So I was very naughty. I mixed up the yellow and the blue, and then mixed them together, and I took it to her desk in saran wrap and put it on her desk to show her that yes, I could get the colors of one. She was sitting there. I mean, printer's ink is very messy stuff. Anyway, yeah, I have been naughty when people won't listen to me.
Well, and the world of children's literature has benefited from that. So now, after the Story a Story came out and won the Caldecott Medal, everybody that I've ever talked to who's won either a Caldecott or a Newbery says that the experience of winning that award is kind of transformative, or at least incredibly memorable. Can you talk about what happened, since that's what we're kind of focusing in on? Is
you really want me to tell this story?
Only the G-rated version.
The what?
No, yeah.
All right. Yes, I won this story. I was standing next to Ursula Nordstrom in Texas,
yeah.
And they announced that I had won the Caldecott. In those days, you didn't know until a certain night. And she said, for Gail Haley to win the Caldecott over Maurice Sendak would be like Charlie Schultz winning over Michelangelo. There was a children's book mafia in New York, and they had decided that Maurice Sendak was going to win for a book called In the Night Kitchen. The Times books, they'd done a full page story on In the Night Kitchen. I mean, they were going around talking to people on the Caldecott committee and saying, now you be a good girl and you vote for Maurice and E.B. Yeah, they wanted E.B. White to win. I forget which book it was. And I mean, that was a little shocking to me. She didn't know who it was, but you know, that hurt my feelings. The following week, after I had won the Caldecott, the New York Times printed a story in the book magazine section, and it was entitled, Has Caldecott's Name Been Taken in Vain? It was written by Barbara Webb, I think. Anyway, I was crushed, you know, and they went after me. And you know, I didn't do anything. You know, I just won. Yeah, but so winning a Caldecott, winning any kind of award, you know, I don't know that there's always that much backbiting or whatever. But at least I knew that I had been accepted by my peers. I don't know if I really got over the hurt from that until I went to England. And in England, you know, there's not big business like it was here in those days. You know, everybody was friendly and fun, and you know, I never ran into that kind of stuff in England.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've learned, that in any kind of tight circle group, there's the ins and the outs, and you know what, you know, people talk about paradigm shifts, but sometimes when something upsets the apple cart, it upsets people sometimes. I do think that in the discussions that I've been privy to, that your book was a little ahead of its time from the point of view of the children's literature establishment, as you're talking about it. They weren't quite ready for it. Well, some people weren't quite ready. The old guard wasn't quite ready for it, but the new guard was. Yeah. You wouldn't have won the award if the new guard wasn't ready for it. But the old guard was not quite ready for it. And I think in some ways they were, you know, there was a tendency to kind of heap awards on the people who've already won awards, and not ready to welcome a new person in the inner circle.
Well, I wanted it to feel like Africa, so I did massive research. It took me a year to do the research. I even had an African lady living with me in New York City, and then a year to cut the blocks. It was the first book that ever had a black god in it. The John Birch Society went after me. Whenever I'd go out to do a lecture, whatever, there'd be somebody in the audience who would heckle me, you know. And my answer to it was, well, you know, I'm sorry, but when I was growing up, they told me that God made man in his own image. And if you look at all the colors that people come in, I think it's arrogant to think that God can only be white. And then the rest of the audience would cheer. But but it was difficult. Yeah. I knew I was in the right place. I knew I was in the right field.
Yeah. Well, it's been, time has been on your side, and A Story has become one of the true classics in the world of picture books. Then you mentioned just a second ago that after the publication of A Story, you went to England and lived in England or Great Britain for a time. Can you talk a little bit about that part of your
8 years.
part of your life?
Yeah. Yeah, well, we were living in New York when I did this, and it got really dangerous in New York. I had my son just immediately after I'd done this book, and when I was printing the book, I was 9 months pregnant toward the end. I mean, it's really hard to reach into a printing press with these big blocks and get them adjusted. But New York got really dangerous. We were living on the Upper West Side, and we had a great apartment. It was like eight rooms with parquet floors and all that. But we didn't have an elevator man or a doorman. And someone followed me into the building one day, and I could see one hand reaching for me and one hand reaching for what I had bought. And something snapped. I turned around. It was summer. I turned around and started screaming at him. Probably every four-letter word I knew. And he was wearing a suit. I mean, you always suss out who's on the street. I was just so angry. And he said, "Ladies don't talk like that." But the fact that I was making a lot of noise, he was afraid somebody would hear. So he ran. And I got in the elevator and I went upstairs and I just fell apart because you don't do that. There had been someone killed in the elevator in my building like 2 weeks before. And when you don't know the rules, I mean, when you don't abide by the rules anymore, you need to get out. So I called my old art teacher, Charles Smith, and asked him to find a place for us. And within 2 months, we were living in Virginia.
Virginia?
Near Charlottesville. In the mountains, and that's how another book came about, because Jack Jewett's Ride. I was living on the road that anyway,
Then from Virginia, how did you get to England?
Well, that's kind of a story I'm not telling quite yet, but
okay, but you did get to England. That's good enough.
Well,
for our purposes,
we wanted the children to go to England so they could be in the English, the open classroom.
Right, that was taking
Montessori and
it really got its movement going in England before it came over to this country. But I know the experience of living in England and becoming interested in British folklore and one of the things that every time I've talked to you about your experiences in England, you always talk about the Green Man. Can you talk a little bit about your interest in the Green Man and how that relates to your life in England and how that then translated into your work?
Well, people may not believe this, but when I was a child, I had some difficulties at home. And the only place I really felt safe was in the woods. My little dog and I would go into the woods. And I saw the Green Man in the woods when I was a child. He's an archetype. And children who haven't been taught not to see things see a lot more things than adults. So I saw the Green Man. I saw his children. I used to make myself clothes out of great big leaves pinned together with sticks. Well, he kind of got out of my life a little bit, but I was walking down the street going to my favorite art store one day, and there was a sign, the Green Man Pub. And it was like, just the way I'd seen him as a child. So I rushed in and I said, "Who's the Green Man and why is he dressed in leaves?" And and the publican looked at me and said, "I don't know, lady. It's just an old sign. It's been there for as long as I can remember." Well, people were not really all that aware of the Green Man anymore at that point. I saw 3 other pub signs that featured the Green Man. And finally I said, "That's it. I've got to find out who he is." So I went to the Cecil Sharp house, which is, Cecil Sharp was the person that convinced people not to let go of their old stories and dances and everything. And there I found a book on pub signs that was over 100 years old. There was the Green Man. They also called him the Savage Man and the Woodwosey and Woodhouse. I mean, found, and then there's a bibliography that big at the bottom. So the British Museum Library was there. The V&A Library was there. And I just went in and just started reading everything I could find out about him. And I had done a costume book, and I was being asked to go all over England to do costume workshops. And of course, that gave me a chance to really study the Green Man in all these different places. One thing that's extraordinary is that when all the other folk characters have been, they've been chipped away during the Reformation, but the Green Man was allowed to stay. In the central roof boss of every cathedral in England, there's a Green Man. Every church has a Green Man. In some places, in Norwich Cathedral, there was a muse, I forget what you call these, but it was long and narrow, and the arches, and there were portraits of Green Men. I mean, each one's obviously a portrait. So there was like a yearly Green Man, maybe, like there is a yearly hobby horse, you know. But all of this just, you know, made him come to life for me. And I could get off of a train and just, I could feel him calling me, and I would go to where I was supposed to.
Well, I remember you did a beautiful book about the Green Man that really captures, I think, the sort of the spirit and the history and the imagery and the connection between the story and nature that I think you can also see in A Story a Story. It's just it's a different characters in a different place, but a similar relationship. Also, when you're in England, you wrote and illustrated a book for which you won the Kate Greenaway Medal, and that's The Post Office Cat.
Yes.
I know you're interested in cats. So can you tell us a little bit about how the Post Office Cat came to be and your interest in that interesting little sub-story within British history and culture?
Well, I woke up one morning and I was getting my kids ready to go to school, and the BBC did this today in England. And one of the stories that they had was that the post office was having a special meeting, that Parliament was meeting, I think is the way I seem to remember it, to decide whether post office cats were getting enough money and whether pregnant females were getting maternity leave, and whether they were getting enough money. Well, that got me. I love cats, that. And so I went down to the main post office at St. Martin le Grand, and I went all the way down to the third basement where they had all these files. And there was this little lady who looked like Mrs. Tittywink. She had pencils all in her hair. And I said, I want to find out about post office cats. And she said, oh, I love post office cats. They had drawers that were as big as this table, full of all kinds of different things. And they had a letter written from the Postmaster General, from a post master to the Postmaster General, asking whether he could have money for his post office cats. London is 1,000 years old, and there are catacombs. I mean, there's so much stuff underground, and they had to go back to using cats to rid post offices and all kinds of buildings. And he was, yes, he asked the postmaster if he could hire cats. And the postmaster wrote back and said, yes, you may, if you can make it clear to the animals what their duties are to be.
So as I understand it, I've learned this from you, is that for a time, all post offices in Great Britain had to have a cat to deal with the problem of rodents eating mail. Is that correct?
Even when I was there, I met several post office cats in different places. The mice and rats are very smart, so they know to avoid certain things that have poison. And they had gotten to a point where they could use a poison to get rid of them that would be so strong that it probably would get into the water supply. So they had to revert. And one of the interesting things is that all the big buildings had cats, but ship's captains had to have cats too, because if there was mouse and rat damage, and he didn't have a cat on board, or at least one cat, he would be responsible for all the damage. So all the ships had cats. And of course, that gives a whole new meaning to Dick Whittington's cat, where his cat ended up being worth a lot of money to the Sultan, where they didn't have cats yet.
Well, and so you wrote this and illustrated this wonderful book, The Post Office Cat.
Yes.
And that book won the most prestigious award in Great Britain for the world in the area of picture books is the Kate Greenaway Medal. Kate Greenaway Medal is named after a famous illustrator, Kate Greenaway. And so can you talk a little bit about what was the experience? You know, you kind of, you broke a lot of molds over the course of your career, but one of the things that you did is that you won the most prestigious award in America, the Caldecott Medal, and then having established yourself as a resident of Great Britain, won the Kate Greenaway Medal, the first and to my knowledge, the only person who's done that. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to win the Kate Greenaway Medal?
Well, it was very exciting, of course. And Judy Taylor called me one day. She's well known for, she was well known for writing the most definitive book about Kate Greenaway.
Mm-hmm.
And
she also did stuff on Beatrix Potter, if I remember correctly.
Beatrix, that's what I meant. Beatrix Potter, that was her. Yeah, that was her thing. And she called me one morning, and I had no idea what was coming. And she said, "Gail, I just want you to know that you just won the Kate Greenaway Award." Well, I was thrilled, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly for that book. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I loved working on that book. Originally, I wanted to do that book in lithograph,
Mm-hmm.
because at the time when that story is based, lithograph would have been the way to reproduce books. And I even had a lithograph machine lined up.
Mm-hmm.
Turned out it was too expensive for me to do it that way. But I worked with the printers to figure out how I could get that feeling in the book. So we did that by, I would do a piece of art that was black and gray, and then they would reproduce that and print that in blue ink on Watman board, which is really good watercolor paper. And the reason they'd use this thing called non-photo blue. And if you separate the black out of all the other colors, you get really beautiful color, pure color.
Like jewel tone almost, yeah.
Yeah, well, you have one plate that's black, and then all the other colors, you do a 3-color reproduction
Mm-hmm.
instead of 4 colors,
Mm-hmm.
and that eliminates the black.
Mm-hmm.
But that was why I got such good color in that book.
Mm-hmm.
And then that was also the book that won the Kadato show in Japan.
In the award in Japan.
Yeah.
So
it translates as very important children's book.
very important children. Well, there you go.
And every child in Japan had to read it and write a report on it.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I have learned is that the Japanese have a fascination with Western children's literature. I remember I was doing research on Beatrix Potter, and I was going to different Beatrix Potter's sites in Great Britain one time, and everywhere I went, there were just tremendous numbers of Japanese tourists who were going through tremendous trouble to see Hilltop Farm for Beatrix Potter, and they knew so much about Beatrix Potter. I was just astonished. I said, you're from Japan? How do you know? You know more about Beatrix Potter than most people in Great Britain do, but I think that they had an interest in that, and still probably do.
I think they published 4 or 5 of my books in Japan. Yes, I was very happy about it. It helped me buy my house on Montford Drive.
Well, there you go. Now, there's another part of the long story of Gail Haley that I'm interested in, and I think our viewers would be interested in as well. And that is when you moved back to America and moved up into the mountains of North Carolina and kind of redeveloped, I think, an interest you had earlier, but in the Jack stories.
Yes.
That we associate with the mountains of North Carolina, the Jack Tales, as they're generally called. Can you talk a little bit about that side of your career and how you became interested in the Jack Tales, and a little bit about the books that you have done that tie into the Jack Tales, which of course are also tied to the British culture that you had spent time in already, because that's of course where the stories came from. But
yeah, it was a time when I got sick. I had the flu, and for the first time I read all the way through The Golden Bough.
mm-hmm.
And I also read The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. And of course that was fascinating, because The Golden Bough is all about the sacredness of the oak and stuff that I was really into at that point. And Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung both talked about the archetypes within us. And of course what got me interested in is that the hero's journey according to Jung and Joseph Campbell, appears in every society, no matter where, no matter what time in the universe. There's been this saga, and it has to do with these journeys that the hero must make. And of course, Anansi is, the first journey is journey up to the sky god. So, and I didn't even realize that when I did it. I just picked that story up. But he talked about the fact that in the mountains of North Carolina, I think he even mentioned that, that there was this oral tradition that still was going on. Maybe he didn't mention that, but I knew it. So when I got back here, back to the United States, my mother was ill, and so I came back to Charlotte. And I met Alice Naylor, who was head of the media literacy department at Appalachian State. I met her at Weston Woods, actually. And she asked me to be writer in residence at Appalachian State. Well, of course, I was thrilled because that was something I was really interested in. And it was one of the few places in the whole world where you can find this saga intact, still being told by people, where it had been preserved for 200 years since people first, the English and the Scottish and all these people first came to America. So as soon as I got there, I started going out and finding these storytellers, and going and sitting at their knee and listening to the stories that they had learned eyeball to eyeball. And that's the way they told it to me. Ray Hicks was one of the most amazing of these people. And he was just a classic folklorist. He was also kind of a shaman. And he'd been given permission to tell these stories by, he used to call her a black-haired woman walking across the snow when they were out hunting barefoot. And she sat down with them, and she told Ray, she said, "Ray, I want you to tell those Jack stories. It's the most important thing that you'll ever do in your whole life." So there's always a shaman or someone who gives you permission or tells you. And so he did. He spent his life telling these stories. And he had what he called a harp, which is a harmonica. Not only did he tell the stories, but he would do the songs and, everything. So I was just completely in love with all of it. And I was doing research there, but it became very obvious that the people there didn't understand the history and the fact that so many of these things went back to Europe and Russia and Germany and France and, and of course you can find many of the Jack tales. I mean, some of the Baron Munchausen stories are also Jack tales. I've found some of them in the Ramayana. I found them in the, why am I trying to think of this? The Arabian Nights, some of the same stories. Well, that's just incredible. It means we need those stories, and they're connected to our unconscious.
Well, you did. I have your Jack tales. I remember you did Jack in the Bean Tree, which is similar to the fairy tale that we've heard of Jack in the
Jack and Beanstalk.
Jack and the Beanstalk, yeah.
Yeah.
But and then you did the one of them with the dragon.
Jack and the Fire Dragon.
Jack and the Fire Dragon, and then you did a whole collection of Jack tales that was more of a short story collection, with of course your illustrations. But I wondered how you went about taking these old folk tales that had been passed down, as you said, in an oral tradition for hundreds of years, and translating that into picture books
for children. Well, of course, the bean tree is more ancient than the beanstalk, and that probably came from the Vikings who intermarried with the people and women in Scotland. And that was Yggdrasil, the tree of life. And Jack was every man. So that was, that was why I decided. When I made changes, and of course there were a lot of words, there were a lot of things that weren't clear from the way they were being told in the mountains. So I basically translated them. It was like this, the patchwork quilt. that I talk about,
Mm-hmm.
that the bits and pieces of the stories, I had to find a way to bring them back together so that it made sense.
Mm-hmm.
Not violating the stories by changing anything that I didn't need to change.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, um, trying to capture some of the humor.
Oh, what you did. Yeah, no, they're funny. And Jack himself is a funny character. You know, he's a mischievous character, likable, a little bit like the Anansi, but you know, there's a trickster quality
He's
to
a
him.
trickster. Yeah.
But he's a resourceful guy who gets himself into trouble, gets himself out of trouble too. I've always liked the Jack Tales, and I thought you did a really fine job with those. Um, One of the things you did in those Jack Tales is you introduced a character that you call Poppy Seed.
Poppy Seed.
Yeah, so I'm intrigued by Poppy Seed. Are you Poppy Seed? Who's Poppy Seed?
Well, I am now. I am now. Actually, I was in Shelby Friday night with my hair all up in, mountain style and apron and everything, telling some of the stories from the Jack Tales. My grandmother was a storyteller. She was amazing, just amazing. She could make things come to life. And she told a few of the stories, very similar stories to the Jack Tales and the grandfather tales. And she just became the person to tell these stories. She remembered an Irish uncle who had one long fingernail that he would use to cut the butter.
Oh dear.
And his hostess was usually pretty unhappy about that. But then there were Scottish people. My grandparents were Bells, and they had made whiskey in Scotland. And when they came to this country, I found out just before my grandfather died that they had also made whiskey using corn. So, but my grandmother she became the storyteller. She was just an amazing, amazing person and changed my life totally. And she was the person really that told me I could do anything I wanted to do. And used to bring me paper when she'd come to see me because she worked for an engraving house. So yeah, she had to be my storyteller. So I just, I can speak mountain, and part of it is because of my grandmother.
Yeah. So she was the grandmother on your mother's side?
On my mother's side.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And
she comes through as a character. She's not just a narrator. She comes through as a character in the books that has some spunk to her, the way she talks about Jack and the way it's as if she's addressing the child audience, which in some ways is the readers that also seems to be there in the book as well.
Well, the people I told stories to last Friday night were at the Earl Scruggs Museum, and it was all grown-ups. No children came, and they loved the stories. Well, of course, Poppy Seed talks about how there was a squirrel up above her, and her parents were sharecroppers, and she was sitting on the quilt up under this tree waiting for them to come back. And there's a squirrel who drops something in her beak, and she picks it up, and it's this bean that has all these wonderful colors. So she listens to see if she can hear it singing. She smells of it, and then, like most young'uns do, she chews it up and swallows it. And all the colors that were in that bean went up into her head, and it grew into a story bean tree. And it's in there, a twisting and a curling and a growing. If you close your eyes, you can see it as well as I can. And every bean on that tree has got a story inside. And when one of them gets ripe, ain't nothing for me to do except tell it. So young's pull up a chair and sit here because I'm going to tell you a story about Jack, that tow-headed scamp who goes trooping down the road with his old hound dog at his heels and his hat pulled over his eyes.
That's how you start the stories. Yep. And I think it's a lovely way to start to kind of introduce both Poppy Seed and Jack and situate the characters. Why do you think Jack, one of the things I find interesting is that the Jack Tales seem to have resonated more in the mountains of North Carolina than where they came from, at least in more recent years. What is it about the mountains of North Carolina where you lived for a time that was so conducive to these Jack Tales for people who were the oral storytellers like you were talking about? There was something about that physical place that seemed to be conducive to the Jack Tales.
Well, this this tradition of the hero's journey resonates with people.
Mhm.
And the people in the mountains were not unlike the people in the Caribbean who had a Nancy. They left everything behind.
Mhm.
They didn't have they didn't have possessions. A lot of them were poor. My great grandparents were sharecroppers,
Mhm.
and but these stories were so rich,
Mhm.
and they speak to our internal archetypes,
Mhm.
and that's why we love them so much.
Mhm.
And people in the mountains didn't have anything. I mean,
Mhm.
I wasn't that aware of slavery or segregation in the mountains
Mhm.
because they weren't rich enough to have slaves.
Mhm.
They just came as they were. And it's really
Mhm.
interesting to find out how they, particularly Scottish people, landed in Cape Fear and came up that way to get to the mountains. But the mountains are magical. I
Mhm.
mean, they have a resonance.
Mhm.
And the Scottish people particularly, when they got to the mountains, felt at home.
Yeah, they found out. And if you go to Scotland, you'll see all the, the kind of rugged landscape there. I think maybe there was some kind of a interesting parallel
It's
there.
the same mountain range
Mhm.
because, I
Mhm.
mean, that's fascinating.
Yeah, in terms of tectonics and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, that is interesting.
But the stories resonated with them.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think all folk tales are meant to teach us what we need to know about living in this world.
Mhm.
And I mean, people in Bali, children in Bali, uh, just saw puppet shows and they
Mhm.
didn't have to go to school.
Mhm.
This archetypal story that they found through puppet shows and some of the rituals that they did, they learned everything they needed to know from art.
Yeah. Which brings me to one, I don't know how you psychically knew this, but one of the things that you and I both have in common is an interest in puppetry.
Oh, yes.
And a long, long time ago, I made my living as a puppeteer, and I'd carve marionettes. And so when I first got to know you, I was intrigued that you had an interest in puppets as well, and using puppets as a way to tell stories. Can you talk a little bit about how you became interested in puppets and how that relates to your interest in storytelling and characters and your life?
Well, my parents both made me puppets. My father carved me a Pinocchio that was a marionette. I guess I was 3 or 4 years old, all carved beautifully out of wood. And as this thing came walking across the room toward me, I screamed and ran away. And I find that children today still are terrified of marionettes because they walk into your space. I mean, everybody, they're used to watching television, but those characters don't
Mhm.
walk out into the room. And so once they know what the puppet is, they love it. And I ended up teaching puppetry at ASU,
Mhm.
where I was writer in residence. The head of the drama department wanted me to teach some of her students how to make puppets because they were doing a play in which they had to have puppets that were part of the story. So I taught them, and then I was hooked again. I mean, I couldn't find any textbooks on how to make puppets out of found objects, which is one of the things I was interested in. I worked with a lot of teachers when I was up there. Teachers don't have any money. There's no money for anything, The kids on the block cost $1,400, and I could teach my students to make a puppet like that for $30. Going to places like Goodwill and so I wrote almost a 400-page book on puppetry arts, giving people the history and then how to make puppets, and that developed into. I eventually made a mold so that you could make puppets out of paper mache. And I do workshops teaching people how to do that.
And there's an interesting connection between puppets and masks. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. Well, if you know characters in any country, you will find that there is a mask of some god or some character. And if there's a mask, there's also going to be a puppet. It might be a flat puppet. It might be a three-dimensional puppet. Of course, mask means persona. That is the being. And masks are magical. I mean, whether it's the Native Americans or people in Padstow or people wherever. when there's a masked play or a being, that being wearing the mask for that moment is the god that they represent. So masks are sacred and puppets are sacred. When they're going to be doing a puppet show in Bali, the Dalang, the puppeteer, does something with the tree of life and asks the gods to give him all the voices that he will need to tell the story. And we'll proceed to do the voices and the sounds and everything else of 30 different characters. These things can go on for hours at night. So, of course, I just got interested in reproducing the puppets.
I've seen some of the puppets that you've made. You use marionettes for the most part.
Yeah.
And your poppy seed marionette, oh, I love your poppy seed marionette. She has such character. And you have a Jack marionette as well.
Jack and Ma and Morning Dove the Witch and, Graybeard. Got several Graybeards. But I've done layers of these. And of course, the most, the last stage we got into was making puppets, marionettes. I love marionettes.
Yeah, that's what I do too. I carve marionettes, and there's something about performing. I always say it's the closest thing you can get to being God, because in carving a marionette, you sort of created a life.
Yeah.
From the point of view of the child who's watching the marionette, who allows themselves to enter into the magic of it all. One of my marionettes is an alligator. As far as the kids are concerned, it's alive, and they interact with the alligator as if it's there, it's alive, and I feel in a weird sort of way when I'm performing with marionettes that the strings are kind of like this conduit through which life flows and goes into this little piece of wood and comes alive, and I almost feel like it exists almost apart from me. Do you feel that way sometimes?
Well, yeah. What happens with puppets are magical. I mean, they really are. But and you can feel it. Like if you get an old puppet, you can sense the things that it's done. It's alive. But you see, the children, the audience, are willing this creature to be, this being to be alive, and you're willing yourself into it to make it come to life. So where the puppet actually makes life, it's But of course, picture books do something of the same thing too.
Well, you have had a long career as a creative person, and you're still creating things today, still telling stories and still writing, still illustrating. But from the perspective of looking back over your career, since we're looking at the 50th anniversary of the Caldecott. From your perspective, as you think back over those 50 years, that half century of being a creator, of being an active participant in the creation of children's literature, what are there a few highlights that you really stand out for you from the perspective of 2021?
Well, my books are all my children. And they are my children. If anyone says anything mean about them, I hate that person. But right now, because so many of my books are out of print, I'm digitizing my picture books. Weston Woods, as you know, did a lot of film strips. Nobody's using film strips anymore, but they were really a good way to teach. And I'm reproducing. I've used 3 of the Weston Woods ones that I still have all the material. I've had to recreate the pictures because the original pictures are the film is going. So I'm reshooting all of them. I got a grant from the Arts Council and bought a camera, a digital camera, and so I've been doing that, and that excites me a lot because for a film strip or that. Putting it into a new media, you have to create a lot of new pictures because children can only sit still for a little bit of the story. So you have to create more pictures. And I have been excited to go back and find that I can still do techniques that I did 30, 40 years ago. So that's been exciting for me. And it's giving my stories a chance to live again, live for today's children.
in this more digital world that they live in. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is my life's work.
Hmm.
All those stories, everything. And I have new books that I've never published. Um, when I get through with all the ones that I've already done, I'll have a chance to go and
Hmm.
do some of that. I don't have a publisher right now, and I don't have an
Yeah.
agent, but I've got a head full of stories.
And you're right. They came from little beans, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, most of them, I guess, did.
Well, you've added so much to the world of children's literature, and um, when I think back on, the children's authors, illustrators who've come out of North Carolina,
Mhm.
you're at the very top. You've really been a major player with your, starting here and moving out, going to England and traveling the world and going to the Caribbean and who knows where else, but coming back here. And I think it's wonderful that you're back here in Charlotte, where the story started.
Mhm.
You have in my opinion, you have an honored place in the history of Charlotte children's literature, North Carolina children's literature, and I'm really proud to be able to call you my friend and have followed your career for so many years. I understand that there are some questions that people have sent coming to us through this magical medium, so I will turn it over to our questions.
Hello, everyone watching at home. My name is Adriana Bennett. I'm the Community Engagement Archivist at Atkins Library, and I will be facilitating the question and answer portion of our program. But first, I want to thank you both for joining us. This is a truly amazing conversation. But I want to read to you the comments from people in the audience. The first comment, well, all the comments are for Gail. The first one is from M. Rhodes. I love all the trickster tales and how every culture embraces and interprets their importance. When I worked at Spirit Square Center for Arts and Education in the 90s, many regional K through 12 students studied your books and came to Spirit Square to create visual and performing art based on Jack Tales, Anansi the Spider, and other vivid stories. Thank you for so generously telling your stories and all of our stories that remind us of who we are. So there's some kudos in there.
Thank you.
And the other one, sorry, I have to scroll. The color separation process by hand was so interesting. I started in publishing during the transition of printed, repro/film, but I've never worked with color plates in that way, and they loved hearing about it. And we will go to the questions. And the first one is for Gail and Mark, can you talk about the lasting appreciation for a story after 50 plus years? What makes a children's book become a classic?
I've mentioned this before. I think it's the archetypal need that we have. If there's a story that touches or came from that place where we've been given all these wonderful clues, and it resonates with us, and that's why once you hear one of those stories, it belongs in your head. It belongs in your life, and I think that's and I spent 2 years on this book. As I said before, I had an African lady who lived with me in New York City. She lived with me for a year. She was from Sierra Leone.
Mm.
It's funny. One of the reasons I brought this along, I mentioned that I was pregnant, and I had stayed up at night to print this picture. And Auntie Nancy, her name was, got up in the morning and came over and looked at this printing on my drawing board. And she said, Mrs., that is Africa. So I knew that I had succeeded.
I think one of the things that makes Gail's books, The Story of Stories, so special is that it's a combination of the universal in the sense that you can relate to the story from many different cultures and many different backgrounds that has that universal archetypal sort of quality to it. But it also is very specific. You get a sense of a place, you get a sense of a time, you get a sense of that when you're reading the story or looking at the pictures, that you're in a particular place. And I think when you're able, as Gail, you have so successfully done, to combine the universal with the specific. You come up with a kind of a magic alchemy that gives the book a special power. And I think a story is a story, and many of Gail's other books, I think, succeed in doing that. So I think that's one of the reasons for those far-sighted people who recognize the wonderful work Gail did with the story a story. I think they recognize that as well when they selected Story a Story to win the Caldecott medal.
Well, I thought they made a good decision.
Yes, they did.
One other question. Well, our next question is not on the list of questions, but I just met you recently last week, and I really enjoyed hearing you talk about your first book, A Kingdom for My Dragon. So can you talk a little bit about that and what the allegory of the story was?
Yes, it was a personal story for me because, as I've said, my parents were not that eager to have me become an artist. The story is an allegory, and the allegory is that the knight has a friend who's a dragon, and people are afraid of the dragon, and so he goes through all kinds of troubles. He has to give up his fiancée because the king is afraid of the dragon. But when he does that, the dragon starts to die, and something inside the prince starts to die, and his fiancée, the princess, can see that, and so she finally says, I can't take this away from you. You have to have it. And so at that point, everyone else becomes convinced, and they all go up to Story Mountain, to the magic mountain where the dragon lives. But that is the story of being a creative person, I think. You have to do it. It's both a blessing and a curse, because there's something inside you that says, I have got to do this. This is my job. Like the shaman was always told by some magical person, this is your job. Even Moses, was told by God, you've got to go out and tell stories. And Moses stuttered. He didn't think he could do it, but that became his life's work for a while.
Amazing. That kind of goes into our next question. So what advice would you give a student or a young artist trying to develop their artistic style and improve their work?
Be true to yourself. Joseph Campbell said, follow your bliss. And he says that he had a lot of friends. I don't know if I upset my mic. He had a lot of friends who spent their life climbing to the top of the ladder. And then when they got older, they found out that the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. I mean, if you do something just to make money, it's never going to give you what you want. It's never going to satisfy that thing in your soul. I was telling the story of Jack and the Bean Tree, a few nights ago. And it's interesting because Jack gets food, he gets money, but he still has to go up there one more time. And the thing that he finds when he goes up one more time is this whole spiritual thing of art. The harp represents that spiritual thing that he needs, that all of us need. And I think for anybody in any field, follow your bliss, do it. I mean, I've seen so many people who don't quite have what it takes to really follow their dream. They always get seduced by money or family or something. But if you're a real artist, you will follow your dream. And that's what we have to do.
Yes. Let's see. Yeah, go ask a question.
Phil, I am so intrigued by the book award process. I've worked on some book award committees. So I just wonder if you ever had any feedback from people that were on the Caldecott committee or the Kate Greenaway committee, that those award committees, and if you have ever been on an award committee yourself.
Not an official one.
No, okay.
I've been judges at a few things, but the interesting thing about the Caldecott, I don't know if they still do it the same way, but they vote many, many times. Mm-hmm. And if you don't get the vote the first time, they keep voting over and over again until someone gets the required number of votes. Of course, what happens then is if you've got two warring factions, it may be some other book that ends up getting the most votes. But I have been told that it was the first vote when they voted on this book. First time. So that there's one thing I think I want to talk about. I talk about the Zen Picture Books. When I do a book, I do almost a holographic kind of research, and I have the pictures which I work on, and I have the words that I work on, but I never replicate anything. If there's a red ball, I won't talk about the red ball. If there's something in the picture, I won't describe it. So I'm leaving a vacuum. And what happens is that children experience putting those things together, so that the story becomes a living thing within them. And I have built all my stories that way. Probably that's another reason why my books have been successful.
Nice. Can you talk a little bit about your research process when you're creating your book? So a lot of your books are based off of folk tales and folklore, or just regional stories, right? So can you talk about what it's like to go into these libraries or archives or what have you, and then transform that into something visual?
I don't always know what the picture's going to be, and sometimes the pictures inform the words. I've taught classes. I've taught for 14 years at Appalachian State, and one of the things I tried to get people to understand is, first of all, give it everything, and research everything. I mean, when I was working on the Green Man, I got a lot of clues just from pictures. The misericords, which are the things that the monks sat on while they were supposed to be, praying and all that, were butt shaped, because a lot of times they were sitting instead of having to stand all day long. And the misericords, I don't know if when you were a kid, if you ever turned up a seat and sat on it when you were in a movie theater. Well, the monks did that. But the artists who created these things, underneath, when you look at the pictures underneath, some of them are rather naughty, because the artists were expressing things they just wanted to express. But I also found that there were clues that I would get from some of those pictures that were not in any of the research that I had done. There'd be just some clues somewhere. And that has happened certainly with the Green Man, to many, many stories. There's also a tradition of the Wild Man. In Germany, there've been some books written about the Wild Man in the Middle Ages, but actually they're the same character. It's just that whether you were an agricultural society or a hunting society. But I met a woman named Kathleen Basford. She was the first person ever to write about the Green Man and photograph him. She went around for 30 or 40 years, going into cathedrals and churches and photographing things way up in the air that no one else photographed. And she was particularly interested in the Green Man. A lot of people use her photographs without giving her credit. But one of the things I talked to her about was, I told her about the fact that I could get off of a train, and which is how I went everywhere in England, and I could just let myself be led by this feeling I was supposed to go and see. And she said, "Gail, I can't tell everyone this, but I do the same thing." And she was a scientist. She did research on plants where they did, they used gamma rays on them. And I think one of the things she was doing with the Green Man was kind of making it to the plants this thing. But the fact that she would admit to me that she could get this feeling about the Green Man and find him. There's a scholar in England right now who's writing a book about folklore and the Green Man, and he's using one whole chapter in his book is about my book, The Green Man.
Nice.
And I've met people all over the world. First time we went to Burning Man, we met a scholar who had written about the Green Man, and he said one of the 4 books that he used in his research was my picture book.
And that brings a point that I think people should remember, which is, yes, we associate picture books with children, but picture books resonate with readers and viewers of all ages. It's a mistake. to think that picture books are just for kids. I'm not saying that they're not for kids. They are for kids.
Yeah.
And kids sometimes see things in picture books adults don't see. But an adult who allows himself or herself to actually delve into the book and get swallowed up by the magic of it all can still appreciate a picture book. It's like saying, oh, well, adults are not allowed to go to art museums. Art museums are just for kids. Well, we all can respond to the visual. And I think it's a mistake to think the picture books are only for kids.
Well, stories are for everyone.
Mhm.
I mean, stories would be told to the whole village,
Mhm.
and they would all sit there. I mean, these grown-ups last week were just like a bunch of kids. I mean, they're just, really into it.
Mhm.
And but it's like in the mountains. There are naughty versions of some of the stories, naughty details. But that is how you know it's a true folk tale, because scatology and sexuality appear in many folk tales all over the world.
Mhm.
But in the Victorian times, when they were cleaning up children's literature, they lost sight of a lot of things that are important.
Part of the energy of the story.
Yeah.
You and I both have this interest in the history of puppetry, and if you look at early puppets, it's like, oh my goodness. But there were things about early puppets that would be scandalous to a modern day audience.
I have puppets that have appendages
Yes.
that are hidden by their skirts. But I mean, that's part of folklore. And it's funny to people. People laugh at all these things. When I was doing the Jack Tales, I didn't do any of the ones that had kind of naughty connotations, like the step husband who's hiding in a trunk. I mean, that raises too many questions. But yeah, I took the ones that I thought were most appropriate for kids.
So I guess similar to the other question about what makes a good children's story, what makes a good puppet?
The ability to accept the life it's giving you, to accept it as a character that you can relate to. And as I said, puppets and masks, by and large, have represented sacred characters. I mean, throughout the world.
I have found that with puppets, that sometimes people get so obsessed with marionettes, which is what I use, of trying to make the strings invisible. They'll use these really fine fish lines. And I said, no, for me, that's part of the puppet. The strings are part of the puppet. It's part of the magic of the puppet.
Yeah.
But what makes a puppet work, in my opinion, is the personality that comes from the puppet, whether it's tied to some ancient religious text or whether it's tied to something more mundane, but still the personality. I think that I went to the Museum of Puppetry Arts in Atlanta.
Yeah.
And boy, those are wonderful puppets there. But you really get a sense of, I spent half a day at that museum. And my wife and my son were trying to say, it's getting kind of time to go, don't you think? I was like, but you look at somebody like Mr. Rogers, his puppets are so simple. They're so simple, and yet the personalities come through, even though the puppets themselves are
like Lamb Chop.
Yeah, or like Lamb Chop, Sherry Lewis.
Or Howdy Doody.
Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to do a series of stories, folk tales using poppy seeds porch, and of course, people from other countries, etc., would come there, but they objected to the fact that they could see the strings on television. So we actually carved some that had moving mouths, but that didn't work either. They were wiggled too much. And so, yeah, you've got to accept the magic of what the strings are doing. Yeah.
Nice. Well, that's all the questions that we have. But I want to thank both of you for coming and joining us. And on behalf of J. Murray Atkins Library, I want to thank our viewers at home for tuning in with us. This has been recorded, so if you register, we will have a recording to you, and you can view it later. So thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.